It's time for Chess Chest!
What?
No, 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 no.
Chess Chest.
Welcome to another Down the Rabbit Hole video, and welcome to yet another episode of Chess Chest, where we're going to be talking about this game in great detail because I really love it. We've talked about a few bits now, and we're moving our way toward the center focus here, which means the next the next piece we're gonna look at is the knight. And this must be, without a doubt, the most iconic chess piece there is. I mean, I've got one here that's a bookend, and it actually came with a rook, which I should have shown when I did the rook video. But anytime you think of chess, anytime it needs to be represented, if there's like a collection of board games in some book or what have you, they always have the knight's head, the horse head, to represent chess pieces and chess in general. So this guy is really iconic and important to the overall game. He's also really old. He's almost as old as the rook, kind of in the same era. What's interesting is, now we call this the knight, and that's our European medieval modified version of the original piece. It was always a horse. And what's interesting is it always moved in the strange L-shaped direction. I'll show you in a second its actual movements. Chess as we know it, with the knight and the rook, is based on Chaturanga, an Indian game which also had the horse. And just prior to Chaturanga was the Chinese game Shang-Chi, which had Ma or Ma, I'm not sure how it's pronounced. But basically, that was also a horse piece, and it moved almost exactly the same way as this piece that we now know. So I think what was going on was in different regions, starting with China and definitely in India, horses and the cavalry were a very important part of the army, and hence that's why they're sort of a mainstay of the army of the chess pieces and have lasted all this time. So I'm going to show the knight or horse's moves in a little more detail on the board in a second. But I just wanted to address the fact that it went through quite a few modifications. In Shang-Chi, that same sort of L-shaped move was always there, but it was blockable. If there was a piece in the Ma's way, wouldn't be able to actually complete the move. And apparently the other two pieces here on the board in their original incarnation in Chaturanga were found to be quite powerful, and this little guy was always getting blocked. So they actually modified his rules a little bit over time, making it so that he could actually jump over pieces. It's the only piece on the board that can actually jump. And also that diagonal shape, or that weird move, a friend of mine actually educated me on what the actual correct movements are. And that is the result of a lot of changes. But its movements had been modified to basically answer the problem of it's kind of weak compared to these other guys in the neighboring columns on the board here. Let's talk about that jump. And also, why does he move in such a strange way? I think, now there's nothing to back this up, I've always sort of imagined, okay, what was it like when Chaturanga, when the spice traders were coming into India from China with all their unusual little board games, and they saw this thing, this Shang-Chi, and created their own version of it with Chaturanga. I wonder if they thought, the horse is such an important part of our military, and maybe you've probably seen those videos of like Lipizzaner horses where they do these odd like movements where they'll rear up on their hind hooves and they do like unusual lurching movements and that kind of thing. Or I don't know, I'm not an equestrian, so I hope somebody out there who knows horses better than myself can answer this. But what's the name of that thing where you kind of trot your horse sideways? I'm sure there's a name for that. The only term I could find that was even close to what I'm thinking of as to explaining the weird jumping movement of the horse, there's something called a courbette or courbet, I don't know. It's an equestrian term of dressage where a horse will kind of rear up on its hind hooves and actually leap, make little jumping movements, but keeping its upper hooves up in the air. Again, it's something that a lot of show horses do in special events. I suspect, or part of me is thinking that this weird movement, especially the ability to jump over, I think maybe somebody was looking at those movements of the horse. Probably when the military is on parade, they wanted to impress the Sultan or whoever was in charge. And maybe that's where some of this weird gallivanting or leaping functionality of the knight came from. Then again, in looking up the history of the horse that led to the knight, it seems like maybe my theory is wrong. This is a strange compromise between the rook and the bishop. And again, as I say, his movements, the knight's or the horse's movements, did get some modifications because these two guys were so powerful. So it seems as though part of why the knight moves the strange way it does is actually because of his two neighbors. And I'll show you in more detail here what I'm talking about. Okay, at the risk of quoting Bob Seger, let's check out some knight moves. So one of the interesting things about the knight is that it's the only other piece other than the pawn that can actually make an opening move, which is kind of cool. And that's one of them right there. Now here he is just on his own, and I've always been very curious why the knight has such a strange move. He kind of goes like forward and then to the side in a weird L shape almost. But, and the other one that I could have done as well is this way here. Let's have another look at that opening move I showed earlier. In addition to our army of pawns here, as I say, the knight is the only other piece that could make an opening move. I've often wondered, why is it that the knight can move in that strange erratic pattern? I thought maybe the leaping action was perhaps a little bit sort of synonymous with how maybe real horses can vault sometimes whenever they're being trained. But I tried looking up some footage of what exactly this sort of leaping action is of a horse in the case of where it's been used in warfare. And although I can find training videos that show horses changing their direction and moving around in a slightly odd manner, most footage that I've found showing war horses doing their thing, especially kind of those early Indian or even Chinese armies that would have used horses back in the old ancient days, they typically just went in a straight line. And I was trying to figure out, okay, well then, that doesn't really explain its movement in this board game, whether it's Chaturanga or Shang-Chi or Shatranj, the Arabic one. How come in the movies, all you see are horses basically going in straight lines and being used for charging, as the various combatants move in to do their warfare? Why is it then that I can only find that kind of footage, and I don't see a lot showing this sort of strange change of the angle that the piece on the board demonstrates? I think maybe because in movies they want to keep the horses, especially up until the more recent times of Lord of the Rings and Lion, Witch, and the Wardrobe, where you might have CGI horses. In classic cinema, you would have had real horses and they didn't want them to get hurt. So probably most scenes were just showing them moving in straight lines all the time. But to get back to why the horse, or to get back to why the knight moves in this particular way, I think we got to bring back the bishop and the rook. Now, we've already discussed how the rook moves forward in straight lines or up and down, and is a very, very powerful piece. The bishop, who we will be doing next, does the same thing but on the diagonal. Not as powerful. These diagonal movements are not quite as bulldozery as the rook, the knight, or the horse, actually seems to have always been a compromise or somewhere in between these two pieces as far as his movements are concerned. I mentioned earlier that the ability to jump over pieces like the pawn, or anybody really, that was a new rule made up because what was happening was this guy was just getting overpowered, especially in the later parts of the game. He was getting overpowered by how good the rook is. So it was decided, all right, well, unlike Shang-Chi, we will make it so that you can jump over pieces, and that'll give the knight a little bit more finesse and interest in the game. It seems like the knight's movements are actually just somewhere in between what the bishop and the rook can do. He moves forward to begin with, as per the rook, and then he moves in the diagonal, as per the bishop. He's really just a compromise piece, which is very unusual when you consider that it's the iconic piece of the game. Now what I'd like to do is talk about the iconic nature of this horse's head on top of the pedestal here that we associate with the game of chess. When they were trying to establish a set type of chess piece, because we now all think of chess as these little guys here, you know, where the pawn looks like that, or where the bishop looks like that, or the king has a little crown on top, or a little cross on top of him. This is the Staunton set, designed by Nathaniel Cook. I'm going to go into a lot more detail about the Staunton set itself, but the horse and the head that Nathaniel Cook decided to stick onto the little pedestal to represent the knight is actually really, really critical to why this is now considered such an iconic piece. And this is the horse's head from the chess set. This is actually taken from a bunch of sculptures that were of horses pulling the chariot of the moon goddess Selene. We're in the British Museum. And it's actually Nathaniel Cook decided to get inspired from this to make the knight piece. It's very distinctive. I mean, if you look at it, you can tell that is from the chessboard. That is the head of the knight. Interestingly, it's actually under strain because it's pulling this big chariot, and the eyes are slightly bulbous, the mouth is open as if gasping for breath. But if you stick that on a pedestal, you got it on your chessboard. That is the piece. So when we were finishing at the British Museum, went into the gift shop, they have Selene's horse sculpture, and I just thought, yeah, as a chess fan, I absolutely have to have this thing. They have them in multiple sizes. It was big enough to fit into the suitcase, but I'm very pleased with this thing. It is flattened on this side, you know, it's mostly for like mounting against a wall or something like that, but to have the origin for Nathaniel Cook's chess piece, that's pretty amazing. These guys, this is the knight. This is a really cool piece. It's got some personal history for me, like all of them do, but it was a learning experience for me, and it's a piece that it just represents chess. I mean, what else can you say about the knight? I think I'll wrap it up at this stage, but there's another episode of Chess Chest under the belt. And I guess all it remains for me to say is we'll see you down the rabbit hole.